Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski. I want to shift gears just a little bit and bring in my friend from Gettysburg, Dr. Doug Douds. And Doug, I've been waiting to call you Dr. Doug, for the last couple months. Doug just recently completed his dissertation, but Doug is a retired Marine Corps colonel who now teaches at the Army War College in Carlisle. Doug, thanks for being with us.
Oh, Chris, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Oh, delighted. Now, I'll just say, if folks have never had the chance to be on the field with you in Gettysburg, Doug's a licensed battlefield guide. It is one of the most incredible guiding experiences you can go on. And there are many, many wonderful guides, but Doug, you are the bomb.
Oh, that's super kind. I've enjoyed every moment we've been out there on the field. There's always something new to share, and of course, trying to make that history relatable to people is an absolute joy.
Absolutely. To me, that's what it's all about. And, no one does it better than you do, my friend.
Well,
Nobody
that's
does it
kind.
better.
That's really kind.
So I've asked Doug to join us to talk about counterfactual thinking as part of our conversation. And Doug, I know that it's something that you've had to engage with a lot over the course of your military career. Maybe if you could just quickly give us a general synopsis of ways in which you've used counterfactual thinking in what you do with the military.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'll tell you, we've really gotten into this more and more, especially here in the curriculum at the Army War College, to try and establish historical mindedness as a way of critical and creative thinking. So we've binned it under critical and creative thinking, but what we want to do is use the past to give us a framework, things that we could find similar, but also dissimilar. In that way, one, it helps us overcome biases. Two, it gives us a little bit of intellectual empathy to stand in someone else's shoes, which becomes a bigger factor when you think about stand in your adversary's shoes when you're doing planning. But then it also means that we ask better questions about what applies, what doesn't. And then if we can go down the road of counterfactuals, oftentimes what that means is we start to isolate what becomes the major variable. As historians, we abhor the idea of independent variables. Everything's linked. It's all complex. But nonetheless, if we play the counterfactual game because you open the aperture of what all the possible futures could be, you must then open the aperture on what every one of those other variables could be as well. So then it makes you think, well, what's the main ones that would matter? And in that sense, it invites you to do some creative thinking, which arguably is some of the most difficult thinking we ask future leaders to do.
And I know on a very practical level, I mean, that just helps with preparedness. You sort of anticipate this could happen, this could happen, this could happen. How do we prepare for that? Tell me a little bit about that. And then I want to kind of go back into some of those leadership things that you just mentioned about.
Well, so your point about preparedness, this gets to the idea of even in planning, you come up with your principal plan, but then we always are talking about branches and sequels, those things that when conditions don't go the way we anticipate, either because we've made assumptions or because perhaps fog, friction, the environment, or the adversary who gets a vote, they interfere with our plan, and therefore we must take a different tack. That's a branch. That requires counterfactual thinking. Additionally, if we think about what our sequence is after we get to this part, what's next? How do we synchronize those tactical activities in time, space, and purpose to get to the strategic end? That requires you to anticipate, well, where would the adversary be? What would their reaction be? What resources do I need to have it put in place? And so in the larger sense, this is planning writ large, which is a big deal when you think about one of the major responsibilities of senior commanders is to be able to campaign, to be able to translate tactical activities into strategic and operational objectives.
And of course, there's that old saying that every plan is perfect till it encounters the enemy. So then having those alternatives available to you so that you don't really have to think about them in the heat of the moment, but you've already sort of mapped them out. That's got to be a huge advantage in the moment, when the plan does encounter the enemy.
Well, so two thoughts. One on the statement, right? Everybody has a plan until the first shot of the enemy, or the idea Mike Tyson said, everybody's got a plan until you get punched in the mouth. It gets brought up here a lot, and I would say, well, then your plan stinks. Okay. If it falls apart at first shot, you should have anticipated they were going to get shot. And moreover, if you climb into a ring with Mike Tyson, you should expect to get hit in the face. So we should account for that, but many other variables in there. And I think that's one of the things that we talk about of, all right, things are obviously going to be changed. It's a dynamic, complex, adaptive environment that you're going to touch, and it will start reacting the moment we start to interact with it.
Now, you talk about how the idea of critical and creative thinking is a big challenge for leaders in a lot of different contexts, not just in the military, but just in general. Is it a particular challenge in the military culture?
Yeah, it's there's also a good question. Um, so if you think about the military culture writ large, and certainly at the time that you start to talk more senior leaders, lieutenant colonels, generals, um, they tend to be some of the most conservative thinkers out there. Now, there's good reason for this. When people's lives are on the line and the fate of nations hang in the balance, this is not a time to start winging it. So they are conservative for a reason, but at the same time, when we're looking for very dynamic and unique ways to address some of these very complex problems that face the nation or the battle spaces that we're going to operate in, it, we really work hard to get them to think creatively. Critically, they can do that really well. Creatively come up with novel combinations, that is much more difficult.
And I'm going to sort of fall back on a little stereotyping here, and I apologize, but the sort of the mindset of like when someone enlists and your job is to follow orders and do what you're told, do what you're told, and uh, and that's not necessarily as you move up the chain the same set of behaviors and skills that you need as you progress.
Well, moreover, if you think about it, even at that lowest level, one of the great strategic strengths of, for instance, the United States of America and its armed forces is we have this wonderful non-commissioned officer and staff non-commissioned officer corps. Because they grew up in a free society where they make their own decisions, we can power down authorities to the lowest level, push that power to the edge so that they can operate at the speed of the problem, even if they don't know, even if we didn't tell them what to do, they have the independence to deal with the problems and come up with unique solutions at that way. This is one of the great ideas of mission command. And it's something that our adversaries, particular countries that come from very autocratic countries, the Soviet Union, now Russia, China has struggled to create an NCO and NCO corps because it's just not part of their culture. So at the lowest levels, we expect that freedom of thinking. But at the highest levels, when it comes up with national leaders approaching senior military leaders to say, give me my options for this intractable problem, that requires some of that critical and creative thinking.
Now, I had the privilege to be out on the field with you in a staff ride. We did Chancellorsville together, and it was to me just a wonderful new way for me to see that battlefield that I'm literally looking at right outside my window right now. But to kind of see it through the eyes of a staff ride, and that was my first time to go on a staff ride. And so that was an opportunity for you to take some of these counterfactual thinking models that you're talking about and apply it on the field. Tell me a little bit about how that all works and why that's particularly useful.
Yeah, so we use staff rides as a great way to teach. We use battlefields as leadership laboratories. Effectively, you think about a history tour is you're going to understand the what and the so what. What happened? What did it mean? A staff ride, we take the next step and we try and go not only the what and the so what, but most importantly, the now what. What did the lessons that they gleaned from then mean to us today? And if you listen to, if we read our clause, which right, he would say we should determine the facts, establish cause and effect, and then provide some degree of analysis. And so what we're doing is we're using that battlefield to pull those what we consider to be the enduring lessons of the enduring nature of war. Think about fog and friction, the human element, fear, courage, leadership, cohesion, and then also the changing character of warfare, technology, and how that changes what we've done on the battlefield over time. So you can pull those strings on what is and unique and enduring, continuing, and what are the parts of inevitable change on a battlefield. And to use the field as a leadership laboratory allows you to do that and engage kind of five senses learning. And in that way, it's really effective because if you can get an idea or a concept to stick, now not only does that idea sit in their brain housing group, but it has a location and a smell and a group that they were with, and their ability now to pull that idea back out at time of need is all the more greater. And that's why it's an effective methodology for teaching.
And to me, what I find so neat about it too is, we talk about usable history. We want to study history so we can learn its lessons. And this is just absolutely A1. Here's how we're going to learn those lessons and apply them in a way that is usable and useful.
Well, and the unique thing is, especially when it comes to staff rides, there's all kinds of criteria, what your objectives are and how much time we have, how much resources, but what level of expertise. But it's interesting that they work. We obviously use them for people who wear the uniform today, and it matters a lot in the profession of arms. But they're also wickedly effective when it comes to business people who don't know a thing. And this is why staff rides work for them. They're separated by two ways. They're separated in time. So, hey, that happened 150 years ago. There's nothing I'm going to say today that's going to change how that turned out. And they're separated by profession. So they don't know anything about flanks and intervals and echelon attacks and rolling barrages, and they have none of that language. So everything that they look at is an utterly wide open lens and a different lens to look at that battlefield. So they think of much more creative ideas of like, how would you have made that decision? How would you have gone about that? So in that sense, it is applicable not just those people who wear the uniform, but people outside the profession of arms.
One of the things that I think is also really interesting is, of course, we're looking back at the Civil War 160 years later. We know how the story ended. But I think a staff ride really puts you in the moment and you forget about the inevitability of the ending, and so what's going on right now and what are the circumstances right now, which I think brings those moments to life in a wholly different way.
Chris, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. One of the key prerequisites of doing a staff ride is to presume that you do not know how it turned out. To stand where those commanders stood, not know how it turns out, and then be able to judge the merits and follies of their decision, of how they communicated, of how they decided, of how they fired the indomitable human spirit of those that they led. And if you can do that, then I think you reap the real benefits of the now what.
Now, of course, being Civil War guys, we hear about these, well, what if this had happened? What if that had happened? Which is essentially what we're asking when we're on the field doing a staff ride and talking about that moment. Well, what would happen here and what would happen there? Some people are a little derisive about the idea of what if questions. Some people find them really useful tools. Where do you fall on that spectrum?
Well, so I think you've captured there is a tension there in these counterfactuals, because you can get pretty far off pretty quickly. If those guys had an AK-47 or an A-10 overhead, like that would have changed everything. Yeah, it would have. But if they had one, then where do you think the North had? What do you think they would have? You know what I mean? It's the whole idea of that gets pretty broad pretty quickly. And this is why counterfactuals must be addressed with a degree of discipline. Because once we open the aperture of all the different history, the potential futures that could come out if we change one variable, it's worth pursuing that if we are in search of what's the variable that really would have changed it. If we get there to the point, though, we soon have to bring in, if that changed, think of how many other things would have changed. In this sense, it's no longer viewing history as this event or this string of events, but rather view it as a web of contingency of all these interrelated variables. I think that's the kind of the cautionary tale of going down there, because it can rapidly get off the rails.
Yeah, and I always kind of look at the Stonewall Jackson at Gettysburg as sort of the great case study. Like, what could happen in the 2 months between Chancellorsville and Gettysburg?
Right.
And so like that, like you can't reasonably game plan that out because of all those contingencies you talk about. It's kind of crazy. Um, as someone who gets out on the field, I'm sure people ask you that question a lot, or no, maybe not that question, but just like, well, what if this or what if that? How do you address those sorts of questions when people bring them up to you out on the battlefield?
Well, I think you've kind of touched on this notion of when we start to talk about the what if game, it is important that we give it context. This is part of what we do as historians and guides, of like, hey, we got to understand in the broader whole. Think of all the other things that would have changed and the ripple effects that would have, but not just on one side, because we empathetically must look on the other side. If we think that's happening, Jackson's there. What do you think the Union is doing that might be different because Jackson is there? Maybe Hooker didn't get creamed. Maybe he stayed on the other side of the river for another day. I mean, it would have changed the outcome of Chancellorsville for certain, let alone what the difference would have been at Chancellorsville. So I think it's always important for us to go ahead and say, hey, remember, to change one variable is to put all the other variables in play. And the other thing then is to bound that in the larger context in which that change would have happened.
I love that idea of, talking about it's an opportunity to provide context, because for me, I love those sorts of questions because it's like, okay, well, let's talk about the assumptions that we're making here and what are the things that are going on. And it really does let you look in a fuller way at a certain circumstance or set of facts in ways that maybe people haven't had the chance to explore before.
So I think this is also very powerful of the idea that we explore a potential future that did not happen, but that means we also have to go back to go, well, wait, if we change the one variable, are all the other things in place to have delivered that future that you just talked about? And that often isn't the case. To your point, now it allows for a more nuanced discussion of all the other variables at play.
Yeah, which to me is the kind of weeds I love to get into when you start talking about that stuff.
No, it's right, but it also is really important to to your point about maybe one of the more fun things we get to do as historians is to do this with other historians to go, what do you think if that happened? To go, oh man, I never considered that, and in that way, it opens again the aperture, but then makes us go back to, well, why did they choose what they chose? Because when they had the opportunity to perhaps pick an alternative future, they didn't. Well, why not? They're certainly as smart as us. They're certainly as talented enough. They wanted to be as successful as you and I. The will to live was as powerful as you and I. So they chose that course of action. And maybe it drives us back to the principal reasons that delivered the history that we know.
Yeah, yeah. And to me, that always is an opportunity then to like think more about why did they make that and be more empathetic and be more critical. And it challenges me to be a better historian when I'm faced with having to do those sorts of things.
I think this is right. And maybe even where we get into that idea of staff rides work and people visit battlefields, because when you come back to the principle, but they chose this, there is an element of inspirational learning that takes place. You recognize, the giants upon whose shoulders we stand today. In spite of all that, they chose that as the course of action. And because you're out on the field, not in a classroom, not reading it from a book, it kind of grabs you for a moment. And that's the power of being on the ground.
Yeah. So going back to that idea of fun for just a second, do you have a favorite Civil War what if?
Well, so we always play with the Jackson at Gettysburg scenario because that one is brought up, and even the plan for July 2nd, the Longstreet's, really the theory, because there's really no more behind it of that march around the mountains there to the south and set up on our own line. Well, but then you have to play that out. Well, what would you need? Well, you need cavalry. You got any cavalry? Not really. How would they have to get there on the roads? Who finds the networks? Cav. Okay. And the high ground, once you set up on that, who's going to, like you, it forces you to go down, like, let's play out that potential course of action, which leads you back to maybe why Lee decided on the course of action he decided. So those are fun ones to play. I think we get into really fun ones when we go overseas too, when you start talking about, hey, what happens when we start to consider a Normandy when we don't have naval and air supremacy? What if it's just superiority? What if they create a window in time, but they don't own it all? And now bring back in German air to that campaign. And certainly as we think about this today for our students, we'll look at Normandy as an anti-Axis aerial denial campaign by the Germans to prevent the Allied entry into Northwest Europe. It looks a lot like the Chinese and the South China Sea, except now aerial supremacy cannot be presumed. And certainly, as we have seen in Ukraine, the whole idea of what the air domain looks like and who can play in it is an entirely different picture. So that changes the picture for us today. And so in that case, we go down the what if chain because now you start to get into the now what. How do these lessons translate to us today?
I had a similar sort of experience when I was recently at Pearl Harbor, and I couldn't help but think, what if that third wave had come through? What if the Japanese had sent that additional wave of bombers, and already knowing what a tragedy took place there, and then it really can lead to some humbling contemplation, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And this is where we get to this notion of truly trying to stand in those leaders' shoes at their time and place, presuming that we don't know how it turned out. I think the other big one is certainly in Lincoln's eyes, the George Gordon Meade pursuit of Robert E. Lee. I would argue that he did everything humanly possible. But if you read almost every end of every Gettysburg campaign books, they come up with a bunch of wild ideas about all the things he could have done, most of which come out to that's kind of crazy. Hell, throw the 6th Corps on the other side of the Potomac. Really? We put a whole corps on the other side of the river like Lee tries to do at every battle during the peninsula? You mean lose your entire largest corps, unsupported by anybody else? Like, that's not an actual idea. But it's worthwhile to play that game to go, well, what options does he really have? And it starts to look a lot like what he did.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, to me, that's always helped me better understand Richard Ewell on the first day at Gettysburg. It's like, well, he does a lot of stuff that we know Jackson had already done, and it's like maybe it doesn't make him look like such a boob after all. When you start kind of playing it out that way.
But to your point, this is where just why the study of history and even counterfactuals is really powerful in the sense that it makes us ask better questions. The exploration of what if forces you to go back, yes, but why not? And then again, it ends up in this more nuanced discussion of what are all the other things at play, and to explore those gives us a deeper and a broader understanding of the current conditions and pressures that leaders faced and ultimately the decisions they made. And that's one of the great powers of counterfactuals.
Wow. Doug, thanks so much for taking some time to chat with us today. I really appreciate it.
Chris, as always, it's a joy. I can't wait to be out on a battlefield somewhere near us both soon.
Looking forward to it, my friend. You take care of yourself, and good luck wrapping up your semester.
Thanks, you too.
Thanks. I'm Chris Mikowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.